When I look back at some of the finest cartoon shows from the 80s and 90s, it almost seems baffling how many of them never got the proper closure that they deserved. As you all know, competition was extremely tough during this era, and many shows fought for one spot in the network. This led to many untimely cancellations, and the fans were left in the dark. One such animated series is the Dungeons & Dragons fantasy that ran from 1983 to 1985. It was co-produced by Marvel Productions, TSR, the original creators of the D&D game and the Japanese Toei Animation, and the show quickly became one of the best on the CBS network. However, the meteoric rise was short-lived because it slowly slipped into oblivion. In this video, I'll look back at all the reasons behind the rise and fall of the show and what on earth happened to this series. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you. For us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin.
Now.
No thanks, Venger.
What was the animated series all about? The show ran for 3 seasons spanning 27 episodes, and the story begins with 6 friends, all of whom are aged from 8 to 15. While riding a magical roller coaster at an amusement, they are transported into the magical and fantasy realm of Dungeons & Dragons. Here, they meet the Dungeon, who guides them in this new world. He gives each of them powers that are aligned with classic D&D character class. The 6 children want to find a way back home, but they encounter numerous challenges along the way. The main villainous force in this realm is Venger, who is aided by the Shadow Demon, and he travels on a black horse called Nightmare. There's also the intriguing 5-headed dragon named Tiamat, who is even feared by Venger. The show offers a varied range of characters like Hank the Ranger, who's the leader with a magic energy bow. The others include Eric, the Cavalier, a rich and somewhat cowardly knight with a magic shield, Presto the Magician, Sheila the Thief, and Bobby the Barbarian, who's the brave and impulsive youngest member of the group. The children have to confront various dangers and villains, most of whom are courtesy of Venger, and they are also guided regularly by the enigmatic Dungeon Master, who gives cryptic advice and missions. While this remains the overall theme of the show, there are also some interesting subplots and emotional, including the connection between Dungeon Master and Venger. Who were the key people who made it all possible? Exploring the stories behind the scenes. The show wouldn't have been such a huge hit without the contribution of some extremely talented individuals who worked relentlessly to make it so perfect. The series creator was Mark Evanier, who you might know from his work on Garfield and Friends. He developed a pilot episode and worked on one more episode, but he left early in production after entrusting the script rewrite to Hank Soroyan, the voice director. CBS was keen on getting the show because they were desperate to acquire a Marvel property to air so that their over-reliance on Hanna-Barbera could be handled. The animation work was handled by Toei Animation in Japan, and they were known for their high-quality work that ensured the spectacular visuals in the show. Of course, the contribution of the talented voice actors cannot be ignored. The likes of Willie Ain, Don Mote, Adam Rich, and the iconic Peter Cullen as the villain, Venger, deserve a special mention. Frank Welker also stepped in with some additional voices and animals. The show was based on TSR's Dungeons & Dragons role-playing game, with rights negotiated behind the scenes. While the references were not always accurate, I loved the voice of Sidney Miller as the Dungeon Master. During the time, Saturday morning cartoons often faced the challenge of animation scheduling. Dungeons & Dragons always ended up with a cut above the average animation quality because of the art team involved. Mark Evanier later revealed how the scripts evolved with time and added more depth to the story, with new characters and villains introduced. This happened because of the additional writers that were brought on board. The end result was the perfect balance that the network was seeking between the commercial interests and the fantasy adventure tone.
So much for the movies.
Time for some fireworks.
How did the show rise to glory in quick time? Today, when you look back, probably see this as a show that developed a cult following with time. But the truth is, the animated series became quite successful upon its release in its time slot. The narrative and wonderful animation loved by the viewers and critics alike, and it spawned over 100 licensed products in no time. The story was appreciated for the fun character and adventure-based theme, and the emotional depth in such a children's cartoon was also praised. Tabletop board games were extremely popular during the time, and the show helped introduce Dungeons & Dragons to a wider mainstream audience beyond the tabletop game. Yes, there were some major controversies that troubled the show during its run, but the popularity remained despite the controversies. The show differed from typical cartoon development because it was based on an existing product rather than starting with a toy line first. In fact, the strong fan following was noticeable, even after the cancellation of the series. Today, when I see all the love for the show and the legacy of one of the best animated shows ever created bestowed by IGN, I feel a strange satisfaction because Dungeons & Dragons cartoon series deserves it all. Some D&D purists may be frowning at the idea of such a cartoon show, but even they cannot deny the impact of this series, the cultural footprint of the entire concept.
Stay away from me, dragon!
What happened to the final episode that was never aired? Before I get to the downfall and random closure of the series, let me quickly take you through the intended final episode that never aired. The script was ready for the finale titled Requiem, and even though the writer Michael Reeves completed the script, it was never produced as official animation. It was later adapted into a fan-made animated episode, used footage in the 2006 DVD audio drama. It's not considered canon, but it still gives the story the closure it needed. The story of this episode sees the Dungeon Master making a wager with Venger, which allows him to set a final quest for the 6 children. If they succeed, they can return home, and if they fail, Venger gains all their magical weapons. The Dungeon Master is forbidden to help them during the event. For this mission, children are instructed to travel to the realm's edge and destroy a key hidden in an empty tomb by casting it into the abyss. Without the guidance of the Dungeon Master, the children are tested. The stress causes the group to split. Some of them decide to accept Venger's quest and believes it to be their only way home, while Hank and others resist working. After several challenges along the way, the divided team finally gets it right, and it's revealed that Venger is actually the Dungeon Master's corrupted son. The children help redeem Venger and restore him from evil, and with Venger redeemed, the heroes are finally offered the portal home. However, there is a hint that not all of the children may choose to return, as some of them feel new responsibilities toward the realm. It could have been the perfect closure, and the fan adaptation gave us that what the network denied the fan. Venger's resolved backstory and the complications of the narrative make me wonder why the network did not go ahead with this one final episode. Unfortunately, the show was canceled before the finale could be produced. This episode was then written, intended as a regular episode for a future season, but even that never materialized. The fans had to settle for the unresolved TV cliffhanger, where the final episode left the main storyline incomplete. The children remained trapped in the realm, and the Dungeon Master offered yet another mysterious path home. There was also another non-canon live-action commercial in Brazil that depicted the kids escaping the realm and returning to their amusement and finally home. But this was done just for promotional. The Requiem episode is probably the closest thing that you'll actually get in terms of a proper completion of the series. How did the downfall begin for the animated series? When the show was first released, it led its Saturday morning time slot. Such was the popularity, craze behind it. However, the decline in ratings started to show up after around 2 years, and this fall was major enough to lead to an eventual cancellation of the series. The competition had become brutal for the Saturday morning slots, and there were far too many shows vying for the spot. Newer, flashier cartoons appeared, and D&D could no longer keep up with the cutthroat competition. I'd say that the red flags and the decreasing ratings started becoming a problem after about 1.5 years of its runtime, and by the 2-year mark, the decline was significant enough for the network to be extremely concerned. This was the beginning of the decline in rating, had many other major reasons as well, which I'll explore in the next segment of this video.
Unicorns are mine.
What a rat!
Did the show become too repetitive for its own good? Well, call me biased, but I never found the Dungeons & Dragons animated series to be repetitive. However, I could not possibly determine the fate of the show, with my geeky friends and the general public opinion different. People felt that the narrative was getting repetitive, as the quests followed the same formula. Things became a bit too predictable for the audience, and people could always opt for alternative shows that offered a lot more thrill. How did the series alienate the original D&D fans? At the end of the day, Dungeons & Dragons animated series was a cartoon meant for kids, and in order to keep the show child-friendly, writers limited the complexity of the narrative at times. This might have been a major reason for the original Dungeons & Dragons fans, or even the ones who started watching the show out of their love for the game, turning their backs on the show. Also, hardcore Dungeons & Dragons players often felt that the cartoon trivialized the complexity of the game, and also avoided the darker themes. This is partly true because, like I said before, the show wanted to appeal to a younger audience. As it turned out, the younger audience sailed for more entertaining waters. This became a major reason behind the decreased ratings, and you could even say that it became one of the main causes for the downfall of such an amazing show.
Hey, wait for me! Sheila!
What did TSR do wrong? to ruin the future of the show. TSR is also responsible for the steady downfall of Dungeons & Dragons, and it cannot be denied that the organization failed to sustain the initial success. If you look back, you will realize that TSR went ahead with an aggressive expansion and overextension, which did not bode well for their content. They attempted to grow the Dungeons & Dragons brand into a multimedia empire in the early 1980s, and this they did by launching numerous board games, novel line, video game, and licensing projects. The rapid growth came at a huge cost and investment in new staff, production, and marketing. When the initial response was strong, they could make back the money, but after a point the company was simply spread too thin. Their entire formula was flawed because TSR could never deal with the financial mismanagement that took down a show like Dungeons & Dragons. Their profit wells were already running dry, and they had assumed that the product sales and viewership would grow indefinitely, which didn't happen. The market saturation also meant that the fans already owned the key product, and what made it worse was the sequence of failed or underperforming expansions that could never make up for the increasing losses. The company suffered from some serious internal turmoil as a fallout of this financial backlash. Debts kept mounting. TSR endured some high-level management shakeups and a cycle of layoffs. The frequent hiring and firing created instability and compromise on real skill. By the mid-1980s, almost 75% of the total staff had been laid off, which led to the loss of both talent and experience. What were the major controversies endured by the series, and how did they affect the untimely cancellation? We probably do not talk about this enough. The Dungeons & Dragons animated series was riddled with controversies that refused to leave the creative team alone. In fact, some of the major controversies during the mid-1980s actually contributed to its eventual cancellation, alongside the declining ratings and internal issues. The series aired during a time of intense public fear over Dungeons & Dragons, known as the Satanic Panic. Many religious and parental groups claimed that the game and the cartoon encouraged interest in Satanism, witchcraft, and occult practices. Yes, I know these claims were quite absurd. No sense. Unfortunately, were often covered by mainstream media. And this created a public opinion against the show. There were many organizations that called for bans or warning labels for the series. The families of some troubled youth wrongly attributed their crimes and addictions to the influence of Dungeons & Dragons. They created a lot of pressure on the network and advertisers to drop support for the series, and also contributed to the declining viewership as a result. There were also some major controversies surrounding the promotion of violence in the show, where parental groups and censors were alarmed by the level of violence shown in the cartoon. There were scenes where the young protagonist considered killing their main adversary, Venger, and there was one particular episode called The Dragon's Graveyard that nearly got canceled because the children were contemplating Venger's murder. In 1985, the National Coalition on Television Violence demanded every broadcast should carry an FTC warning stating the show had been linked to real-life violence, and this didn't do any positive publicity for the series. Aside from these major controversies that brought about the downfall, there were also allegations on Dungeons & Dragons of perpetuating racial stereotypes through their depiction of certain monsters in fantasy.
The Beholder!
Lastly, failure of merchandise and toy lines was the final nail in the coffin. You can check out the best of cartoon shows from the 80s and 90s, and you'll realize that the failure to launch a profitable merchandise tie-in or toy sale led to the downfall of many stalwarts. It was the same with Dungeons & Dragons during its original broadcast run. There was a major lack of a substantial, timely merchandise tie-in. The contemporary, like He-Man, G.I. Joe, and Transformers, were doing much better, and they were designed in tandem with toy lines, but there was no such support for D&D merchandise or toys. LJN produced an advanced toy line, but the figures focused more on the game characters. Hasbro released them decades later. I wish someone did it back when the show was actually running and becoming popular. Nevertheless, these factors came together, ensured that the network pulled the plug on a show that could have had a longer and more promising run if these aspects were handled correctly. Marvelous verdict. Legacy of the show will always be an example for future D&D cartoons. I'm a huge fan of the detailed lore of Dungeons & Dragons, and even though the cartoon adaptation from the 80s is not necessarily accurate, I still like the narrative that the series offers. Given the massive popularity of Dungeons & Dragons, quite likely we'll have another animated series at some point, and this 80s show will serve as an example for such future endeavors. The simple and subtle storytelling that made the show so entertaining is hard to come by nowadays. It gives me all the more nostalgia kick while talking about this series. There have been movie adaptations after this, nothing really compares to the charm of the iconic 80s cartoon. I just wish the show got a longer run and reached a wider audience, but at least people are still talking about the brilliance and legacy of Dungeons & Dragons even today. Do let me know in the comments below what you think and the reasons behind its downfall. Also, share your views on the possibility of a revival of this underrated gem through a remake or a reboot. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks, everyone.